Welcome back, McFly subscribers. Today, we're going to be starting a new series on tying bass flies. And to start this series off, I will start with the Clouser Minnow, one of the easiest and most versatile streamers ever created. And these work for more than just bass, but is a fly I always keep in my box when going out bass fishing. Now, I will discuss this fly and its uses in more detail further in the video, as I'm sure you all want to get started tying right away. But in case you haven't seen this channel before, this is McFly Angler.
Starts now.
Okay, let's start tying. Place the hook securely in your vise. For a hook, I'm using Risen's Streamer 200 in size 8. Now this is a long hook, 4x long to be exact, and it has a down eye. Now the down eye isn't necessary, but it does have some benefits that I'll discuss later in the video with you. This also is a normal gap hook, as it is true to the gap of the hook size. Now here is a Streamer 300 for comparison, and this is a more common hook that many would be familiar with, and you can use it. But as you can see, these are both size 8, which means they have the same hook gap. However, the 300 is a 6x long shank, which means it's quite a bit longer. So use whatever hook you want, but I really like the length of these Streamer 200s. Okay, we'll also need some thread, and today I'm using Vivas 140 power thread in white. Vivas 140 is a flat thread, which does pose some issues with this fly. However, it is very strong. So you could use something like the 6/0, which is a round thread. And I found the round thread helps to hold the deer hair in place better, but the 6/0 is a little thinner and therefore more fragile. And I pull very tight with this fly, which could break the thread. So I use the 140. But if you find a round thread which is extremely strong, then you can use that as well. Also, you're welcome to use any color thread you want, but for Clousers, I tend to tie them in white, as it gives me a nice white belly. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's start our thread with a small gap behind the hook eye, and then bring your thread down to about the halfway mark on the hook. Then snip off the waist. Now with touching wraps, bring your thread up to about a hook eye shy of the hook eye, and then come back down to about halfway down the thread base that we just made. What this does is give you a thread base for the eyes to rest on, but it also will help you make sure that the eyes are placed in the perfect spot every time. Many people tie these with the eyes way too far up the hook shank, and you want them about a quarter of the way down the hook shank. Okay, now for the eyes. I'm using Risen's brass Dumbell eyes today in size 3.2mm. You could use the 4mm, but I find them a bit too large for this size hook, so I'm using the 3.2 for this size 8 hook. Of course, if you're tying these larger, use the larger Dumbell eyes. If you want these heavier, you could also use lead Dumbell eyes. These will cause the fly to sink very quickly. And you could also use bead chain eyes if you want the fly to sink a little slower. And Risen has these in multiple sizes, so use whatever you want. By the way, they also make these in other colors as well, like these awesome chartreuse ones. Now, bead chain is lighter, so it's important to use a down eye hook. This is because it will offset the line connection and force the hook to swim hook point up. And this is necessary when using lighter eyes like bead chain. Okay, whatever eye you're using, it's a good idea to add a dot of super glue before putting the eye down and tying in. To tie the eyes in, you want to make X wraps over the eyes. Here, let me turn this sideways so you can see what it looks like. Make many tight X wraps, and then start making under wraps. These under wraps will basically wrap around the underside of the eyes, and this will tighten up the X wraps and help keep this from spinning. Now these are very tight, but they can still spin with some pressure. So I like to add some of the Solarez Ultra Thin Resin. It has a handy paintbrush in the cap for easy application, so just paint a little on the top and underside of the eyes, and then cure it with your UV light. Now you could also use super glue, however it takes a few minutes to dry, and the Solarez resin will dry instantly when cured, allowing you to get back to tying right away. Now we need some bucktail, and I'm starting with white as it will be used for the underbelly. Bucktail comes in many dyed colors, more than I have here, so get creative and tie these in whatever colors you want. However, I usually use white for the underbelly. Now the hair on the base of the bucktail is more hollow and has thicker fibers, and this will cause the fiber to flare a little. So I try to use the fur up towards the tip of the tail. Let's separate out a small amount, you don't need much, and clip it off the tail. Now pinch fairly close to the tips of the hair, and we need to stroke out the shorter fibers to make this tail more even. Okay, let's measure out about 2 hook shank lengths, which will leave a tail about 1 hook shank length. Transfer that measurement to your other hand, and then we need to cut this off square at that measurement like so. Pull out a little room to tie the fiber in, and then put the tips down at an angle, canted off to the inside of the hook. Make 2 loose wraps, which will rotate that fiber to be even on top of the hook shank, and now slowly pull the fiber back so it's out of the hook eye. Then make a couple more tight wraps to clean up the head and lock those fibers in tightly. Then we need to jump underneath the dumbbell eyes and make 2 wraps behind the eyes. Now we can make open spiral wraps down the hook shank until we reach the hook bend. And we need to actually lift the fiber up slightly, which will ensure that it gets tied directly on top. When we reach the hook bend, start making open spiral wraps back up to the dumbbell eyes. I like to try and get the wraps to form an X with the previous wraps at the same point on top of the hook, like so. When we reach the dumbbell eyes, we want to make 1 extra wrap behind them, and then jump forward back up to the initial tie-in spot, right behind the hook eye. Then we turn the fly upside down, and readjust if we need to make sure it's angling flat. Now for some flash. You can use Flashabou like this, or crystal flash, which is basically just twisted up Flashabou. Pull out 2 strands from the hank and clip them off. Now I like to measure this out to about the length of the tail, then you can tie it in with a couple tight wraps. Now pull the forward-facing flash rearward and around the other side of the hook and tie that in as well. Now you can cut the flash off so both sides are even. By the way, keep the waste, as it should be enough to tie another fly with. Okay, let's cut another clump of whatever color you want. Today I'm using chartreuse. By the way, I need to buy another chartreuse bucktail. I didn't realize how low I was, but it does make sense because I use this color so often. Alright, prep it in the same way by pulling out the shorter fibers, then measure it on the hook, and you could tie this in the same length as the tail. However, I like it slightly longer. Cut it off square, and then tie in the tip the same way as the white clump, by angling off to the side, which will allow the thread to push it directly on top. Then pull it back out of the hook eye and make a few wraps to tighten it. Now we can whip finish the fly, but make sure that the tag end is in line with the hook, on top of the eyes. And I always try to whip finish from back to front. I then take it out of the vise and position the top wing fiber back and split the hook with it. Now we can use more of that Solarez ultra thin resin to cement the head. It will penetrate the thread wraps and also into the bucktail, helping to keep this fly super durable. I also like to run a line of resin down the spine and on the fiber that is over the dumbbell eyes, because this is an area that gets frayed often with fish teeth after strikes. So this step helps keep the fly looking new even with multiple fish strikes. Okay, well there we have it, the finished Clouser Minnow, one of the most widely used streamers on the planet. Now this is just speculation, but I would venture to guess that this is second only to the woolly bugger in most popular streamers. The original tyer was the late Bob Clouser, a legend in fly fishing. He made many great patterns, and the Clouser Minnow is probably his most popular. Now this series I'm doing is of bass flies. Unfortunately that is a wide brush to paint with, as there are many types of bass and ways to fish them, from smallmouth to largemouth and everything in between. They can be fished in different ways, so many of the flies in this series will be my favorite flies to fish my specific area, for my type of bass. However, this Clouser Minnow will be one that can pretty much fish all of them. It is great for smallmouth, especially in chartreuse like I tied today, which is actually what this was originally developed to fish for by Mr. Clouser, but it can catch just about any bass. And also can be used for trout, saltwater fish of varying species, and pretty much anything that eats small darting baitfish. You can tie these heavy to sink into deep holes, or light to fish more shallow areas and cover lots of water. Here is one I tied with bead chain eyes, in the electric chicken colors, pink and chartreuse, which is great for smallmouth or heavily stained water. I also use a chartreuse thread here, which gives it a different look. You can tie them with more muted colors like this olive one, which I use crystal flash rather than Flashabou for. Here is a yellow version. You can also change up the materials and make a craft fur Clouser, which if you've ever used craft fur, you know it moves really well in the water. Because the weight is quite forward on the hook, these flies will sink head down, but when twitched or stripped, it will dart up, giving the fly an enticing spastic darting motion, which looks a lot like a minnow fleeing. It is also very streamline, which means it does sink quickly with minimal weight, and you can get down deep even with these brass dumbbells. Okay, well I'm starting a new box for this bass series. And look how many Clousers fit in this box. Just one row fits 7 to 8 of these flies, with room for more. And that is because the Clouser is so streamlined. So every month I'm doing a new series on different flies. So last month I did a panfish fly series, where I tied 5 different flies that I use for sunfish. In that series I tied the bully bluegill, foam beetle, Carter's rubber-leg dragonfly, panfish gurgler, and finished the series with the panfish popper. So if you're interested in watching that series, I will link to it below at the end of this video. Next week I will continue this bass series with a crayfish fly I developed that I call the McFly McCrawl. So make sure you're subscribed and click the bell notification so you don't miss any future videos like this McCrawl fly. Oh, and by the way, I will soon be selling these fly boxes on Amazon with free shipping. They're made entirely of foam, which means they float in case you drop it in the water. They're also not too thick, so they don't take up much room in your pack. Yet they can still hold some decent sized streamers without compressing the materials. And on both sides as well. The clasp is magnetic, and the magnets are very strong. And I've had these automatically close almost every time I've ever dropped them, which means you're less likely to lose flies due to clumsiness. Now, they're not available yet for sale, as it takes a while to get these up on Amazon, but I will link to my Amazon storefront so you can check out my other fly boxes. And keep checking back, because these foam boxes will be available soon. Also, don't forget to check out my sponsor, Risen Fly. They made the hooks I use today, but they also make some of the best fly rods and reels for the money I have ever used. Best off, they're offering you all a discount. So if you're in the market for a new rod or a bunch of hooks or beads, go to www.risenfly.com and type in McFly at checkout, and they'll give you 15% off of your first order with them. Okay, well, thanks for watching. If you like this video, do me a favor and click the like button. Also, if you could share my videos with all your fishing friends, I would be much appreciative. I will see you on the next video. Now you go catch some fish.